My name is Jessica Carroll. I'm 35 years old, and I want to tell you about the moment I watched my father cry for the first time in my life. He was standing in the second row of a military auditorium in Fort Bragg, North Carolina. The ceremony had been going for about 40 minutes. The citation was being read aloud by my commanding officer, the specific language of military commendation, the formal recitation of what happened and when and what it meant. He did not know I could see him. I could see him. He had his hand over his mouth. The specific gesture of someone who is trying to contain something and is not entirely succeeding. His shoulders were doing the thing that shoulders do when someone is crying quietly in a public space and has committed to the idea that no one will notice. He thought no one saw, I have not told him. I need to start much earlier than that auditorium because the auditorium only means what it means if you understand the 32 years that preceded it. My father, Thomas Carroll, is a man who was formed by a specific set of beliefs about what men were and were not supposed to do, and those beliefs were formed in him early and reinforced thoroughly by the culture he grew up in, a working-class neighborhood in Pittsburgh in the 1970s, a household where his own father expressed love through provision and work and physical presence and almost never through words and never through tears. Real men don't cry. He said it the first time I can remember when I was approximately 7 years old. My brother had fallen off his bicycle and scraped his knee and was crying in the way that 7-year-old boys cry when they fall openly, fully, with no awareness yet of the performance of toughness that would be required of him later. My father had knelt beside him and said, not unkindly but with complete certainty, "Real men don't cry, you're all right." My brother stopped crying. My father's intention was not cruel. I want to be precise about this because it matters to everything that follows. He was delivering what he understood to be useful information, practical preparation for a world in which the expression of vulnerability was a disadvantage. He was doing what had been done to him. He was being the father he knew how to be. He said it to my brother several more times over the years. He said it in variations to my male cousins when they visited. He said it in the ambient way of someone who considers a thing so self-evidently true that it requires no examination, just consistent reinforcement. He did not say it to me specifically because I was a daughter and the rule as he understood it was gendered, but I heard it. I heard it every time he said it to my brother, and every time he said it in passing, and every time the message was delivered without words, in the silence after something difficult, in the pivot away from emotion toward practicality, in the specific quality of a household where feelings were acknowledged only when they had already resolved themselves into something manageable. I joined the Army at 22. My father's response to this was characteristically practical rather than emotional. He asked about the benefits. He asked about the career trajectory. He asked whether I had considered the risks carefully, and when I said yes, he accepted that I had and moved forward. He did not express pride, not then. He expressed what I had come to understand as his version of support, which was the absence of objection and the presence of practical engagement. He came to my commissioning ceremony. He shook my hand after. He said, "Congratulations." He did not hug. Over the following 12 years, my father tracked my career in the specific way he tracked things he cared about but did not know how to express caring about, through questions about logistics and structure, through following the news about the units I was assigned to, through knowing the names and functions of the bases where I was stationed. He was engaged. He was attentive. He was doing the work of following my career without doing the work of expressing what following it meant to him. I was promoted to Sergeant First Class at 28. He called to acknowledge it. He said, "I saw the announcement. Good work." I was selected for Warrant Officer Candidate School at 30. He called again. He said, "That's a significant step." I was awarded my first commendation medal at 31 for actions during a training exercise that had become a real emergency when civilian hikers became lost in a wilderness area where my unit was operating. We located and evacuated 3 people over a 14-hour operation in deteriorating weather. It was not a combat situation. It was a significant demonstration of exactly the kind of leadership and technical competence that military training is designed to produce. My father said, "I heard about the medal. That was good work." I said, "Thank you, Dad." He said, "You should be proud." I said, "I am." He did not say he was proud. The Medal of Honor ceremony. I want to be clear about what medal this was because in military culture, medals exist in a hierarchy and the specific medal matters to understanding the weight of what was being recognized. This was not a routine commendation. It was a Distinguished Service Medal, the Army's 3rd highest peacetime award, given for exceptionally meritorious service to the government in a duty of great responsibility. I had been recognized for 18 months of work on a medical logistics restructuring project that had significantly improved the efficiency of medical supply chains for units operating in austere environments. The work was complex, technical, and consequential in ways that were not visible to outsiders, but that the Army's senior medical leadership understood and had decided deserved formal recognition at this level. It was the kind of recognition that most soldiers do not receive in an entire career. The ceremony was formal, a significant event by any measure, held in the installation's main auditorium, attended by senior leadership, unit members, and the families of the soldiers being recognized. There were approximately 200 people in the room. My father sat in the second row. He had driven from Pittsburgh, 6 hours. He had not told me he was coming. He had coordinated with my mother, who told me the morning of the ceremony. I remember being surprised and then understanding, in the way you understand things about people you have known your whole life, that the not telling was his version of the gesture. He was showing up without making it a thing he had to talk about in advance. The ceremony proceeded in the formal way of military ceremonies, the specific order of events, the citations read aloud, the music, the presentation of awards, the receiving line. I was one of several soldiers being recognized, and the ceremony moved through each recognition in sequence. When my citation was read, I was standing at the front of the auditorium. I was in my dress uniform. My commanding officer was reading the specific language of the commendation, what I had done, why it mattered, what the Army had decided it deserved. I was looking at the audience. Military training instills a specific kind of awareness, the ability to scan an environment without appearing to scan it, to take in peripheral information while maintaining primary focus on the task at hand. I was standing at attention, focused on the ceremony, and I was also with the peripheral part of my awareness that never fully turns off, tracking the room. I found my father in the second row. He was looking at me, and he was crying, not dramatically, not the full expression of grief or overwhelming emotion. The quiet kind. The kind that a man who has spent 30 years not crying does when he cries in a public space and has committed to not crying and is not in touch. The hand over the mouth, the shoulders. The specific quality of someone containing something that is larger than the container they have built for it over a lifetime. He thought no one saw. The ceremony continued. I received my medal. I shook hands with my commanding officer. I stood through the remaining recognitions. I participated in the receiving line. I smiled for photographs. I did all of the things that a soldier does at a formal military ceremony. And I carried, in the part of my awareness that does not turn off, the image of my father in the second row with his hand over his mouth. The reception afterward was warm and uncomplicated in the way of military social occasions. Food, conversation, the gradual unwinding of formality into something more personal. I moved through the room talking to colleagues and leadership and family members. My father found me near the end of the reception. He looked the way he always looked at formal occasions, composed, controlled, the specific presentation of someone who has decided what he's going to bring to a room and is bringing it. There was no visible evidence of what I had seen in the second row. He had put it away. He had done the work of returning himself to the version of himself that he considered appropriate for public display. He said, "Good ceremony." I said, "Thank you for coming." He said, "6-hour drive is nothing for something like this." I said, "I didn't know you were coming." He said, "Your mother thought I should surprise you." I said, "She was right." He said, "She usually is." He looked at the medal on my uniform. He said, "That's significant." "What you did?" I said, "I thought so." He said, "The citation, the work you did on the medical logistics." I said, 18 months of it." He said, "Lives?" I said, "Potentially. If those supply chains fail in the field, people die waiting for what they need. If they work, people live who might not have." He said, "And you fixed them." I said, "I improved them significantly. It was a team effort." He said, "The Army gave you a Distinguished Service Medal." I said, "Yes." He said, "That's not a participation award." I said, "No, it's not." He said, "Your grandfather got a Bronze Star in Korea." He said it in the tone of someone making a connection, drawing. I said, "I know." He said, "He never talked about it much." I said, "You've mentioned that." He said, "He kept it in a box in the closet. I found it after he died. I didn't even know what it was at first." I said, "Did you ever ask him about it?" He said, "Once." He said, "It was for doing what needed doing." He said, "I think about that sometimes." I said, "What do you think about?" He said, "What it costs to do what needs doing. What it takes to be the person who does it without making it into a bigger thing than it is." He looked at the medal again. He said, "Your grandfather would have been proud." I said, "I hope so." He said, "I'm proud." He said it quickly in the tone of someone who has prepared the words and is releasing them before the preparation can second-guess itself. Not a grand statement, 3 syllables. The specific sound of someone saying something they have been meaning to say for a long time and have finally found the moment for. He said, "I'm proud of you. I should say it more than I do." I said, "I know you are." He said, "Do you?" I said, "Yes, the way you follow my career, the 6 hours, the way you read the citation." He said, "I read it 3 times in the program before they read it aloud." I said, "I know, I saw you." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "I'm not good at this." Said, "Saying what I mean, about things that matter." I said, "I know." He said, "My father wasn't either. His father wasn't. It's a way of being that I inherited and never fully examined." I said, "Real men don't cry." He said it at the same time I said it. We looked at each other. He said, "I say that too much." I said, "You have." He said, "Your brother." I said, "I know." He said, "I think I've done him some damage with that." I said, "He's working through it." He said, "And you?" Different rules applied. He said, "Did they?" I said, "Somewhat, but I heard it every time you said it to him." He said, "And you learned not to." I said, "I learned to choose when." He said, "When to what?" I said, "When to feel things in front of people, when to contain them, when to let them show." He said, "I've never been good at that last one." I said, "I know." He said, "Jessica." I said, "Yes." He said, "The ceremony, were you watching the room?" I said, "I always watch the room, training." He said, "The second row." I said, "Nothing." He said, "I thought no one saw." I said, "I know." He looked at me. He said, "I'm sorry." I said, "For what?" He said, "For 30 years of real men don't cry, for what it costs to say that to children, for not being better at this." He gestured slightly at the space between us. I said, you drove 6 hours. He said, yes. I said, you read the citation 3 times. He said, yes. I said, you cried in the second row. I said, that's saying what you mean, Dad. That's exactly what that is. He said, I should have learned to do it with words earlier. I said, you're doing it now. He said, I'm 63 years old. I said, yes. He said, better late. I said, considerably better than the alternative. He smiled. The genuine one, not the managed one. He said, your grandfather would have said the same thing, minus the considerably. I said, he was more economical. He said, very. We stood there for a while longer in the way of two people who have just said the real things and are letting the real things settle. Then he said, can I buy you dinner? I said, yes. He said, somewhere not military food. I said, there's a good Italian place about 20 minutes from here. He said, perfect. We had dinner. My mother was there and my husband, and it was a good dinner in the specific way of dinners that happen after something important has shifted, warmer than usual, more present, people saying things they might normally leave unsaid because the occasion has created permission. My father ordered wine, which he rarely does. He raised his glass near the end of the meal. He said to my daughter, who does what needs doing? My mother said, here, here. My husband raised his glass. I raised mine. I looked at my father across the table. He was not crying, but his eyes had the quality that eyes have after someone has cried and stopped, the specific brightness of someone who has spent a certain amount of emotional energy in the preceding hours and is running on the aftermath of it. I said, thank you, Dad. He said, for what? I said, for the 6 hours, for reading the citation 3 times, for being in the second row. He said, I'll always be in the second row. I said, I know. He said, wherever the row is. I said, I know. We finished dinner. He drove back to Pittsburgh that night. I am 35 years old. I am a chief warrant officer in the United States Army. I have a Distinguished Service Medal in a frame on the wall of my office at home. My father said real men don't cry for 30 years. He cried in the second row of an auditorium in Fort Bragg and thought no one saw. I saw. I have not told him I saw. Or I told him in the way that the conversation told him without using those specific words. He asked if I was watching the room. I said I always watch the room. He said the second row. I said nothing. He knew that I knew. That was enough. Some things do not need to be said directly to be said completely. Real men don't cry. My father cried, and in the crying was 32 years of love that had never quite found its way into the words he knew how to use. I saw it. I have held it carefully ever since. That is the whole of this story. That is everything. There is something that happened about 3 months after the ceremony that I have not yet told you and that I think belongs to the full picture. My brother called me. Marcus is 38, 3 years older than me, living in Pittsburgh with his wife and 2 kids. He is, by most measures, doing well. He has a good job, a stable family, the ordinary successful life of someone who figured out what he needed and built it carefully over time. He called on a Sunday afternoon, which was unusual. We talk regularly but usually by text, the communication style of siblings who love each other and are both busy and have found the most efficient form of maintaining the connection. He said, I need to tell you something. I said, the one at Fort Bragg. He said, yeah, I couldn't come, you know that. Work thing I couldn't move. I said, I know. He said, Dad went. I said, yes. He drove 6 hours. He said, I know. He told me about it when he got back. I said, what did he tell you? He said, he told me about the ceremony, the citation, the medal, what you did. He said, and then he said something I've been thinking about for 3 months. I said, what? He said he cried. He said he was sitting in the second row and they were reading your citation and he cried. He said, my father told me he cried. I did not say anything for a moment. He said, in 38 years, Jessica, in 38 years I have never heard him say that about anything. He's never told me he cried. He's never admitted to crying. He's built his entire identity around not crying and being proud of not crying and teaching me not to cry. He said, and he called me on a Sunday night and said he cried at your medal ceremony. I said, Marcus. He said, I know it's about him and you and your career and what you did and I'm not making it about me. He said, but I want to say something. I said, okay. He said, thank you. I said, for what? He said, for being someone he could cry for doing something big enough that it broke through 30 years of real men don't cry. He said he called me. Not because I asked, not because it came up. He called me to tell me. He said, I think he was telling me it was okay. I sat with that for a long time. I said, did you hear it that way? He said, yes. He said, I've been doing a lot of therapy, you know that. I said, I know. He said, one of the things I've been working on is what it cost me. The real men don't cry thing, what it cost me over 30 years to absorb that and believe it and perform it, he said. Legitimately, it did cost me something real, he said, and then Dad called me on a Sunday night and said he cried at your medal ceremony. He said, and something in the anger went quiet. I said, why? He said, because he told me. He didn't have to tell me. He could have kept it private, kept it contained, managed it the way he manages everything. But he called me and said it. He said, I think that was him trying to show me something different about what he is. He said, I don't know if he knows that's what he was doing. I said, I don't think he does. He said, but it helped. I said, I'm glad. He said, Jessica, what you did at that ceremony, not the medal, the way you do your career, the way you just keep going without needing him to understand it, the way you gave him something to cry for without asking him to cry. He said that mattered. I said I wasn't doing it for him. He said, I know, that's what mattered about it. I thought about that for a long time after we hung up. He did not do it for him. That is what mattered about it. My father cried because he was in a room where the evidence of his daughter's career was being read aloud in formal language and he could not contain what it meant to him. Not because I arranged for him to see it, not because I had been doing the work with his reaction in mind. Because the work was real and the work was mine, and the work had accumulated into something that a formal military citation could describe and an auditorium could witness. And my father, who had spent 30 years telling my brother that real men don't cry, had called my brother on a Sunday night to tell him that he had cried. Not because he had decided to change. Not because therapy or reflection or a deliberate reconsideration of his framework had produced it. Because the ceremony had simply been larger than the container he had built. And in the overflow was 30 years of a father's love looking for a different outlet. He found it in the second row. He told my brother about it on a Sunday night. My brother called me on a Sunday afternoon 3 months later. I am telling you now. That is how these things travel imperfectly indirectly, through the specific paths that people find when the direct paths have been closed for a long time. I am 35 years old. I am a chief warrant officer. I have a distinguished service medal and a father who cried in the second row and told my brother about it and gave my brother something he had been waiting for without knowing he was giving it. Real men don't cry. My father cried. And in the telling in the Sunday night phone call to my brother, he said something he had been unable to say directly for 38 years. That is the complete shape of this story, not the medal. Not the ceremony, the Sunday night phone call, the thing my father told my brother that my father didn't know he was saying. That is enough. That has always been enough. Some things arrive by indirect paths. The path does not make them less real, it makes them more so.